Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the day, looking at the fashion industry and circular economy. So my name's Phil Purnell. I'm a professor at Leeds University, and I'm also a visiting professor at the Royal College of Art. And anyone who's done their homework will know I'm a professor of largely concrete-based technologies, which begs the question, what am I doing here? Well, I'm also recently become something of an expert in the circular economy, and as such I was asked to join the RCA to advise them on circular economy, and I'm now the co-director of the Textile Circularity Centre, looking at a circular economy for textiles and apparel. Now, this session's all about the circular economy, as it tends to get billed, and we might well ask ourselves, what do we mean by the circular economy, or perhaps more precisely, a circular economy? Well, there are as many definitions as there are conceptions of circular economy, but one that we might use is to say a circular economy is designed to minimize the extraction of virgin resources and the associated social and environmental impacts by preserving the value of products for as long as possible. Through technology, business models, and changes in social practice that promote reuse, repair, refurbishment, and eventually recycling, we will reduce waste, carbon emissions, inequality, and exploitation. So that's a definition of a circular economy, but I'm very pleased to be joined today by three people who are much closer to the coalface than I am. Shailja Dubé, who's the program lead at the Institute of Positive Fashion. We have Danielle Elsener, who's a fashion designer and an RCA graduate and the founder of zero waste fashion house Decode. And Sarah Gray, who's a senior research analyst at the Waste and Resources Action Partnership. Now, each of our panelists have been seeded with a question, and I'll come to you in alphabetical order. So, Shailja, tell us a bit about yourself and your conception of the circular economy. And I think the question you were seeded with was, how do we ensure everyone can have access to a circular wardrobe? Shailja. You're on mute, Shailja.
I am. Thank you very much for that intro, and absolutely delighted to be here today. So I'm Shailja Dubé, and as Phil mentioned, I lead the Institute of Positive Fashion for the British Fashion Council. And essentially that means I'm responsible for the strategy and the delivery of the BFC's commitment to help the UK fashion industry really transition to being leaders in responsible creative businesses. And I guess in the context of the circular economy, that also means how we can be much more resilient and really future-proof our businesses, as well as, of course, making sure that we are doing so in a just way for society and ensuring transformative action for the environment as a whole. Me personally, before I joined the BFC, I led the responsible retail agenda for Accenture UK, and that's where I really focused on the intersection of sustainability and business in the fashion and wider retail sectors. And that's really when, I guess, the power of corporation and the role that corporations have to play in businesses and brands to help change the overall paradigm when it comes to sustainability agenda and ensuring that we can really reach consumers in a new way. That became very clear to me. The role that businesses have to play is, of course, part of a concerted effort of action with other actors as well. And I guess just to touch upon the BFC before I go to the question, Phil, is the BFC, for those who don't know, we are an industry body for designer businesses in the UK, and not for profit. And our key role is really to oversee and support and to advise on key issues, and as well as opportunities for those aspects that are facing the British design industry today. And of course, the sustainability agenda comes into that. And we have so many amazing designers in our community who are sustainability natives, I would say, and really making significant moves to sustainability and circularity as a whole. We've increasingly been shining a light on those achievements really through well-known events that everybody knows about. So London Fashion Week, for example, and pushing forward these new generation of British designers to the global stage. What I guess people don't really realize as well, we speak regularly with government institutions, and we have a crucial role to play in terms of liaising with government and presenting the issues that are facing our industry and essentially seeking support to what our industry needs. And that could be financial support, but it could be also regulation support. So just to bring that to life when it comes to, say, Brexit, for example, what does the new UK and EU trade agreement really mean to UK British designers? So we would deep dive into that. And through the Institute of Positive Fashion, what we've been doing is really through our 3 pillars: environment, people, and community and craftsmanship. We have focused on circularity as our inaugural project under the environment pillar. And we are doing so through a great program of work called the Circular Fashion Ecosystem Project. And through that, the focus there is to create, I would say, viable systems level change to enable that fair and just transition. And when we think about a fashion economy, I guess when it comes to the question that you asked, Phil, it's around access to a circular wardrobe, but there's so many different roles that the ecosystem has to play to enable that for the consumer. And one of the key things that we're looking at is actually the role that new business models has to play within that. So when we look at rental, subscription, what actually does ownership models look like in the future? Is clothes as a service? Is that something? We're seeing increasingly this e-commerce, resale, just industry really taking off. So how can we ensure that as a British fashion industry, we are creating the right environment to enable those business models to thrive? Focusing, I guess, on the waste hierarchy. So when we think about circularity, it's easy to think about and focus on recycling immediately, but actually we're considering reduce, reuse. Recycling is really the third component there. So how can we reduce consumption and reduce, I guess, in a way, ownership as well, and reduce our reliance on virgin materials and resources? So we're thinking about how brands can now embrace predictive analytics, for example, and address inventory waste, and also how local manufacturing and on-demand manufacturing can play a role in that landscape.
Great, thanks very much, Shailja, for the introduction there. That's really interesting. I think touching on business models there sort of leads us neatly into Danielle's piece, really. So Danielle from Zero Waste design system Decode. So Danielle's based over in Portland in Oregon, so it's considerably earlier in the day for her than it is for us. So whether that makes her brighter or less bright, I'm not sure. But Danielle, the sort of question we seeded you with was, what are the quick wins that businesses can act on immediately to move towards more circular models? And I know that from your work, sort of reducing waste is certainly one of those pathways towards achieving a more circular business model.
Yes. So as Phil said, I'm Danielle Elsener. I am founder of Decode over in Portland, Oregon. I work on zero waste systems design, really thinking about the whole picture of the whole industry using zero waste as a model rather than just the pattern making aspect of zero waste design, which I love, but I know that there's more to it than that, and have been focusing basically my whole career on figuring out how to integrate these solutions into industry at scale, which is really the hardest part of the whole process. In addition to these systems, I work a lot on creating the tools to create so other designers can understand how to use zero waste design from the very beginning of their design education. And educating designers who are going to be going into industry is one of the most important things we can do. In terms of the question, what are the quickest wins that a business can do quickly? When you look at the numbers of cost and material savings of using a zero waste design model, it's an absolute no-brainer. There are some companies I've worked with where I've managed to save them, $7 of just base goods from a zero waste design, which multiply that out by hundreds of thousands and by, all the numbers that go into making a final retail cost of something. That's a pretty high number to have just been throwing away for, their whole design before that point. So, just starting by looking off at the most base thing we can do, which is using zero waste patterns to reduce waste of fabric and material. And then going further into that, rethinking the way that the production system is actually working. One of my biggest things over the next 10 years is creating a zero waste factory model where you actually design the factory to create the product that you know you're going to create in a zero waste way. There isn't anything that exists like that yet, and changing what exists to that is quite difficult. Getting people on board, or changing mindsets is quite difficult from an industry that's been so established for so long. So it's definitely something that's a huge work in progress, but there are those simple steps that we can start with, just looking at consumption and patterns and things of that nature. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Danielle. And finally, to introduce themselves, we have Sarah. So Sarah is a senior research analyst at RAPS, that's the Waste and Resources Action Partnership. So Sarah, you're probably considerably closer to policy than many of us. And the sort of question we seeded you with was, how can we make the business case for a circular economy? And of course, we need to make the business case as much to government as we do to business. So perhaps you could sort of introduce yourself within that context.
Hi, yes. So the work that I do at the Organisation Waste and Resources Action Programme is really focused on two things. We have a voluntary agreement with industry, with retailers and brands, and working together towards reducing the environmental impact of the sector. So Textiles 2030 in the UK actually launches in a couple of weeks' time in the UK, with some quite ambitious targets to reduce impact, in particular a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. And making the business case, I think, is all about actually knowing that what we're setting out to do is going to make a difference. So businesses are keen to know that if they're moving into adopting more circular business models, customers want that. And we know from our research that there's a growing appetite amongst consumers, especially young people, for circularity in general, but in particular for resale, for secondhand, for sharing platforms and swapping platforms, for being able to talk to each other actually and kind of work with each other to kind of find those unique or quirky outfits that will answer their sort of needs and what they want to be able to do to sort of identify themselves. So there's this really growing appetite, and that's been sustained over quite a long period of time. So the first step in making a business case, is there an appeal to this? And there is, but there are lots of different audiences that you can hit with it. It isn't just a young thing. There are options for sort of designing clothes for all markets, really. And then, is it something that's cost effective? Well, Danielle's been describing how zero waste design can actually reduce the cost very much of bringing new items to market. We know that some of the alternative business models also, offer to sort of reduce the amount of costs. If you're perhaps opening a rental business, for example, you want to rent clothes to people instead of selling them new clothes, you can get some profit from that item of clothing every time you rent it out. So we're really looking at dematerializing where the revenue is coming from. And then there's another thing which I think is perhaps slightly new, but businesses are really getting on board with the fact that they need to drive down their environmental impact. And we're seeing a lot of them coming forward with quite serious commitments that are based in setting targets, measuring their impact, knowing where that impact is occurring. There's a lot of work in doing all of that measurement, and that's where I focus my role in RAP. But it does mean that when they're making a commitment to an environmental improvement, they should have to go and do something. And technology is letting us trace a lot more effectively and find out a lot more effectively where impact is. So those commitments to environmental improvements require real action, and circularity offers a way that that actually real actions can be taken that make a difference, and more of a difference potentially than a lot of other things that we can do.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So you've used my favourite word there, which is good, which is dematerialisation. And I think very often within discussions of a circular economy, there's an awful lot of focus on recycling. I'm going to say something mildly controversial and get you to react to it, in the three of you. In my opinion, in a circular economy, if you're recycling, then you've failed. Recycling is to the circular economy what landfill is to the linear economy. Do you think that that's true? And do you think the fashion industry is in a position to genuinely dematerialize, to move towards selling or concentrating on the sale of its service rather than the sale of ever more kilos or square meters of its product? Maybe Danielle, you're closest to the business. Perhaps you could start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though it's controversial, I agree with you because there's so much more of a move, or there's want for a move towards things more like repair, resell, reuse, and people are getting more and more on board with that all the time. And I think that from an industry perspective, there are a lot more people that are looking at that business model. Like even Nike announced the other day that they're going to start taking shoes back, cleaning them, making sure that they're usable, and then reselling them at a discount, or shoes that were manufactured with a slight defect now are being sold in their stores at a discount, so it's also changing the idea of what is an acceptable product, if that makes sense, like the quality control. If those standards change slightly, that changes a lot of impact of product that would originally have been gone to waste or to recycle from the beginning. So that's like one area where there is a lot of change happening, and it's one of the easiest steps to be taken by a company. And then in terms of, recycling is actually the failure. There are so many steps before that where things could be caught and put into a different portion of the cycle, or diverted to other people or different areas, or reused by someone else. So I definitely agree with you there. I'm going to keep thinking about that because I haven't heard that proposed in that way before. So yeah, I'll pass it on to you guys.
Okay, maybe not that controversial then. Shailja, what are your thoughts on this from a sort of high-end fashion point of view?
It's a really great question, and it feeds directly into our circular fashion ecosystem project. Really about what are those pathways to a target vision state that all stakeholders and actors should really be striving for. And I guess they may, in answer to your question, I think that there is a roadmap, right? There's going to be many years between us and an ultimate vision where we don't need to recycle at all. But the current, I guess, reality is we have mixed fibers in our clothing. We have a lot of clothes are not going to be suitable for resale or reuse. And I just think, as a parent as well, I just think about how my daughter goes through clothes quite quickly. So those items that have been well loved and well used, not necessarily suitable for resale, but in terms of trying to keep that value again, then there is always going to be a need, I would say, certainly for many years, that the recycling technology needs to be improved. And there is going to be I guess a level of awareness that as consumers, we also need to be aware of where the access points are to recycle. There's an infrastructure that needs to be implemented to make those points of access easier, and that education for everybody to understand what can be recycled, what can't be. And going back to the brands as well, could there be an approach where there's clear, intelligent labeling within clothing design as well? It helps with the whole transparency angle as well, which is hugely important for the industry, I think. So I guess in conclusion, there's a level of investment that's needed, continued innovation and better access to a consistent supply of quality feedstock.
Great, thank you, Shailja. I'd certainly agree with you on the need for a coherent infrastructure in this area. And I suspect Sarah would as well. Obviously, the Waste and Recycling Action Partnership, you'd be reluctant for me to dismiss recycling entirely. So recycling is obviously a necessary transition technology. So how close do you think we are to moving away from the complete focus on recycling to a focus further up the waste hierarchy?
It's a good question, actually, and I don't think we've got the focus on recycling right yet. So there's quite a lot to do to be able to effectively recycle a mix of the fibres that are in our clothes at the moment, and even the garments that are designed to be readily recycled. There are still lots of challenges with them. So we do struggle to recycle blended fibres. We do struggle to endlessly recycle textile fibres. There are some kind of challenges for us there. So I think actually there's something to be said for if we could churn less, if we could keep things revolving around, but perhaps not quite as many times, then the recyclability is improved. And one way to do that is actually just to get the most out of the garments that we've already got first. And I guess I'm kind of making the point to agree with what other people have said already, really, which is that that comes first, and the recycling is the kind of should be the thing that is at the end of the line, what happens rather than the first option. But we've got quite a lot to do actually to sort that out in itself, and I think we do still need that fallback, and we need really to invest in infrastructure to make sure that sorting can be done efficiently and effectively, to make sure that we've actually got some great ways of recycling garments back into garments again, so that we keep their value.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. Well, we that's clearly sparked the audience off, because we've now got quite a few questions coming in. So I'm going to move to audience questions now. We've got some specific ones for some of our panelists here. So first of all, Shailja, it's a question from the audience. How do we make sure we actually achieve positive fashion and not greenwashing?
That's a great question, and it's hugely important, because we see this significantly with brands, and I'm not just talking about fashion and retail brands, but brands in other industries as well, where perhaps what's being represented isn't quite what one would deem as being sustainable. There's regulation coming in against greenwashing. I'm not quite sure of the time frame for that. So that's going to be one approach. So bringing it back, I guess, to where policy and regulation has a crucial part to play in this landscape of the future. It's hugely important in transition, because there's of course voluntary commitment when it comes to preventing greenwashing and ensuring that there is a level of responsible action that each brand and business needs to take incumbent upon themselves. But if policy can also be another tool by which to drive consistency across the industry, then I think that can only but be a good thing. And when it comes to positive fashion, I guess what we're trying to do at the BFC under our Institute of Positive Fashion is really to map out a path and the different levers and the different initiatives out there that can help with the pathway to becoming much more responsible businesses. There are amazing tools out there, great collaborative organizations as well, that can help everybody with their path to a more responsible business.
Thanks, Shailja. And I think, Sarah, from your point of view, I think you mentioned about measurement and data in these systems, understanding that flow of materials and what it looks like and what its quality is key to be able to say whether something is green or isn't it. Is that correct, Sarah? Is that something that RAP is beginning to grapple with, the lack of data in the sector?
The types of fibres that are used and where they come from, that's a really key part of it, and certainly has a really significant impact when looking at particularly the climate impact of garments, then raw materials accounting for maybe about a third, roughly, of the total impacts throughout the life cycle at the moment. So that's a pretty sizable chunk, and if we could actually trace back where things were originating from, then it would certainly help to be able to then do something about reducing that impact. But actually the reality is that if we keep relying on using more raw materials, then you can only reduce that so much by moving to kind of better production methods and moving to organic fibres where you're growing crops and things like that. And that, I mean, that's better than carrying on as we were, but it kind of only improves things to some extent. And that, I think, is why there's a huge role for circularity to play, actually.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think, labeling is all well and good, but unless you trust the data that's behind the label, then it's very difficult to know who to believe, and I think people are very, very wary about that. Slight change of tack. There's a question directly for you, Danielle. What's the hardest garment to make with a zero waste pattern, and should this affect the product lines that we choose to make?
So I would say that from a blank perspective, there is no garment that's harder than another one. It's literally the ease or difficulty comes from the people you're working with, and willingness to change or willingness to accept slight differences in design based on zero waste design. There often come in challenges where, if I'm coming in as a third party to a company, say, and they want to create one of their garments that's like an iconic style, and then I come in and try to like zero wasteify it. If there are non-negotiables that I cannot work around, then that makes it the most difficult. It is my standing point that every garment can be made zero waste in some way. There are so many different ways that you can go about designing, even based on the materials you're using. Like if you have a circular knit, that completely changes the way you design a zero waste garment versus a flat garment, because you can design in a tube rather than on a square or a rectangle. So yeah, I would say the flexibility of the companies and people you're working with makes things the most easy or difficult, interestingly.
Danielle, and I think this next question is for everyone really, but I think it in some way leads into that. So having access to the kind of technologies that allows you to do these things is important. And we've got a question here. Do you have any tips for brands embracing sustainability, but who are based in the global south, who don't have waste management systems, who don't have the technological advances or the sustainable manufacturing models? We all know, even an outsider like me, that this particular industry is intricately connected with activity in the global south. What can people there do, or how can we encourage them to do things, or perhaps how they can encourage us to do things? Because I know there are great advances in places like Bangladesh and India. How can we work together to take account of this fact that people in the global south might not have access to certain materials or technologies? I don't know who wants to take that one. Don't all jump at once. Does anyone like to take that one? How do we make sure that perhaps, if we have a supply chain that includes perhaps some relatively low technology industries in the global south, how can we make sure that us on our ivory thrones in the global north, we can make pronouncements about sustainability, but much of our supply chain reaches into areas where they might not have the resources or the ability or the technology to do some of the things we're asking them to do. Danielle, you've unmuted. Well done.
Yeah. No, I'm just going to say I might not have the answers on the most technology front, but I would say even just us in the global north, as we're designing and trying to create our supply chains, the fact that there's not a whole lot of accountability for companies. If we go out of our way to actually go to the places that we're asking to help in our supply chain and actually talk to the people, that's half the battle right there, I would say. There's such a lack of communication all the way across the chain. And it's sometimes intentional to keep certain parts of the manufacturing process separate from others so that there isn't mixed communication, or so priority secrets are kept, that kind of thing. But I think that opening those lines of communication and being able to talk directly to the people that you're working with makes a really big difference, even technology aside. I'll let someone else take on that side of the question.
Shailja.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's really relevant and pertinent, and I guess it's part of a set of considerations when it comes to unintended consequences as well of the work that we're all respectively doing to try and drive forward whatever this wonderful new vision state looks like. And I guess I'm not directly answering the question quite yet, so I'm just kind of thinking it through a little bit more. But I guess another side of it is also to understand what is the impact as a result of the significant amount of textiles that we export overseas from the UK, and actually what does that look like in terms of a future model, and how do we want to track what's happening with those garments and those textiles going abroad, because that could be both causing a waste stream just elsewhere, but it could also be contributing to local economies. And I guess there is a lot of investment with certain brands as well. They've started setting up recycling centers in, as you mentioned, Phil, Bangladesh. I think there was one announced recently. So I think there's a huge role that transparency and traceability has to play, and making sure, as Danielle says, that there is that communication open and there's a transparency between those of us in the global north and the global south, not just from an environmental impact around the amount of textiles and garments being produced and potentially needing to be recycled, but making sure that from a societal impact as well, we have a very equitable supply chain.
Great, thank you, Shailja. Sarah, did you want to weigh in from a wrap perspective on that?
I don't think I've got a huge amount to add, but I'd also say that there's something around the traceability and transparency of where we're sourcing from and where things are being produced. That is, on the one hand, we're asking for a lot more information, and I know that sometimes that ask is asking quite a lot. Actually, we're really asking for the businesses that we're working with to step up and put in a load of extra work, and particularly where technology isn't there to sort of close that gap. Sometimes it's just something else for someone to do in their day-to-day. But that also needs to apply at both ends of the supply chain. I think one of the things that's come out of the conversations that we've had in preparing for Textiles 2030 is that we need to see much better understanding, much better information, not just on where we're sourcing from, but also on what happens to the stuff that we're then sending back when we don't want it anymore, and the stuff that's kind of being exported for recycling. And I know that I'm picking up on a point that Shailja has just kind of alluded to already. So I'm not sure that there's a huge amount more to say than that at the moment, because there's so much that we don't know, but we do need to take steps in that direction to get much better information.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And I think while we've got you unmuted, there's a question from Ismay here. So people are putting their names on questions now, which is always encouraging. I've found that many manufacturers are entrenched in old ways of working and are very resistant to change. How do we tackle this as micro brands with very little power? So I know this is something that RAP have looked at. Sarah, how do you think micro brands can encourage manufacturers to change their ways of working?
That's a great question, and I would say work with other brands. And so if you are finding it difficult to kind of get the information that you want, or the change that you want, or the products that you want, then collaboration is your answer. And there will be somebody else who's gone there before you, who's been able to ask those questions, potentially with a much bigger budget from a much bigger organisation. And they'll have found all sorts of things haven't worked, and hopefully they might have found one or two nuggets of information that are helpful. Not everybody's open to sharing that information really, really widely, but if you find you know, a collaborative forum that you can join where people are just sharing information amongst a much wider group, then you can really sort of gain from that and potentially some leverage from it as well. So talk to people and ask questions and turn up to events like this, because they're wonderful for kind of getting ideas and sparking off sort of potentially, you know, new networks and innovation.
Great, thanks, Sarah. The questions are coming thick and fast, and we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and move my way through them. There's a great question here from Ashley. I really like this. Circular economy emphasizes services in fashion and textiles, but there'll always be a need for some new production. Who will decide the standards for new products? Who will be allowed to produce in a circular economy? A great question. Who will be allowed to produce new, and who will have to reduce, reuse, and recycle? Who'd like to take that on? How do we regulate, I suppose, the implementation of a circular economy? Oh, Shailja's going to jump in. Shailja.
Yeah, I've unmuted because it's something that we're thinking about a lot at the moment. Haven't quite come to a conclusion with that because it's a work in progress. But I guess it's about the coordinated action around understanding consumption habits and the art of the possible in terms of capacity, and whether different types of manufacturing models, for example, onshoring, can take place, and actually how a new paradigm for business in British fashion and the UK can actually play a role in a wider landscape. Because I think there's also a discussion here, not just about fashion industry, but also adjoining industries as well, contributing to a collective circular economy and sharing infrastructure, for example. Business policy and regulation can play a part in, I guess, establishing, as the question poses, what is new and the capacity for that new. I'm not quite sure how that's going to be done, I'll be honest. We're still, it's quite a complex question to be asking, but the right one, I would say. I haven't answered that directly, I'm just giving you a few thoughts, but yes, I'll stop there for a moment.
Well, I suppose the question, it's a political question in many respects. The prevailing orthodoxy would say that we adjust the market such that the market sends the correct signals, and other orthodoxies would say no, this has to be very heavily regulated. So I suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. Danielle, we often blame the USA for market forces. Do you think the market will fix this, or do you think there is a role for perhaps some more stringent regulation?
I don't think the market will fix itself. I don't think there's enough incentive. There's not enough incentive money-wise, or, you know, and there's not. And it's a really interesting question and problem. I think that one of the most impactful things that could happen, not regardless of regulation, but one of the easiest regulations to be put in place would perhaps being, make companies responsible for what they overproduce and what they waste. And that's easier said than done, I suppose, because there are some of those things in action already, like people have to ship their waste or get rid of it or pay for it to be taken away. But, you know, there's more of a move towards a made-to-order business model. Could that be put in a larger sphere where things only get made when they're needed? I don't know how that would work with larger mass fashion companies, but it's a thought. So yeah, I also don't have the answer on that, but I know that the market isn't going to fix itself. So it's a very, again, complex question that we need to be asking. So.
Shailja,
could this be where the extended producer responsibility tax could play a role as well? And I know that DEFRA have started a consultation for that. So that's quite interesting to understand how existing models, such as when we came in, and I think that was like 2009 or around about then, and the role that has to play, EPR, in structuring a way forward for our industry.
Sarah, extended producer responsibility, that's very much something I know RAP have been involved with.
Well, they have that already in France, actually, and have done for 10 years. It's something that they've now decided to kind of ramp up a bit. They've got more structured and sort of further reaching modulated fees so that they can take further action. They're now looking at introducing EPR in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in New Zealand. And yes, Shailja has just said we're looking at there should be a consultation taking place on that sort of later this year in the UK. I don't think it's the complete answer. I don't think it will do everything. The fees ought to bring some money into the sector. They should be targeted directly at providing for recycling and reuse. So that money is sort of gathered with the explicit understanding that it is to be then targeted at improving the textile sector, who are paying those fees after all. But it isn't necessarily the complete answer. We need really good, clear information to be provided to consumers. So consumers need to know what they're expected to do and what is, what's the right thing to do in a range of different circumstances. We need to know that once we've got that money, that's actually then going to be used to sort of fill the gaps in terms of where the infrastructure is in a way that will help to reduce impact. And we've already discussed the fact that recycling isn't your first option. So it's not the complete answer, but I think it might help quite a lot. Actually, it's a pretty progressive policy to be considering, so it might help quite a lot.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So we're coming to the end of our time now, but there's a question just popped in at the end, which I think is interesting. It's addressed to you, Shailja, but I think everyone can probably have a final sentence on it. So someone's asked, I'm wondering how much the BFC sees brands as the ambassadors for circularity. Is this something designers need to push for? And I think you and I have had a discussion about the extraordinary ability of the fashion industry to add an awful lot of value to a relatively cheap amount of material. This is a huge power that the industry has and could be used to drive circularity very strongly. So Shailja, are brands the ambassadors for circularity?
They have a huge role to play, absolutely. And I think it's really great questions coming in. Thank you, audience. Brands have an opportunity to play such a huge role with the consumer as well. So and that role can play a part in educating the consumer. And as Sarah was just saying, how as a customer, how can they be behaving in a more, I guess, sustainable consumption manner? What are the things that one needs to look for? Recycling, of course, is one part of it. But can they also use this as an opportunity when it comes to new business models to engage with their customer beyond that point of sale and really strengthen that relationship with your customer base, which I find quite thrilling and wonderful. That's a real opportunity that a lot of brands can really take forward. And the transition to circularity, of course, is not going to be easy. And I guess arguably it's easier to do so from the ground up than to retrofit, especially in a larger corporate and a larger business. But I guess our advice would be to be transparent. There are tools and organizations out there, as I've mentioned before, that can help with the transition to circularity. But it's actually okay to be a work in progress. There are going to be constraints.
It's okay to be a work in progress. I think that's all we've got time for there. And I think transparency and it's okay to be a work in progress is a good note to end this on. So I think I'd say thank you very much to Shailja. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you very much to everyone in the audience for your excellent questions. So my name's Phil Purnell. I'm sure our contact details are all on the website. And if anyone wants to follow up with anything, then feel free to do so. And I very much hope that you've enjoyed your Fashion Factory Day.
Thank you.
And I think that's us.